It's March 15th, 44 BC. A man pushes a scroll into Julius Caesar's hand. It names every conspirator in order by name. Caesar folds it up and keeps walking. What if he'd just read it? That's the whole hinge this story swings on. Not a battle, not an army. A folded piece of paper Caesar never opened. Because if he does open it, if he reads that scroll, or listens to his wife, or trusts the strange man who's been warning him for weeks, the second half of Roman history never happens. No Augustus, no Roman Empire, the way you learned it in school. Something else entirely. Here's the thing, everyone gets wrong about the Ides of March. We treat it like an ending. The tyrant finally gets what's coming to him, 23 stab wounds, dead at the foot of a statue of his old rival Pompey. Almost poetic. But that's not really what happened. What actually happened is a conspiracy that nearly fell apart before it started. It survived on luck alone because one stubborn man refused to believe anyone wanted him dead. Pull that one thread out and Rome doesn't get an empire, it gets something else. First, you need to know how much power was sitting in one man's hands by early 44 BC. Caesar had already won Rome's civil war. He crushed his rival Pompey years earlier, hunted down the last resistance, and came home the only man left standing. By 44 BC, the Senate, Rome's council of powerful men, the ones who were supposed to run the republic together, had made him dictator for life. Not the old emergency job, 6 months and done, for life, no end date, no one who could remove him. He sat on a golden chair, wore the purple robe usually saved for victory parades, didn't even stand up when senators approached him, which by Roman custom was a serious insult. Rome hadn't had a king in 450 years. Getting rid of kings was basically the founding story of the Republic. And here was a man acting an awful lot like one. So a group of senators decided to fix that the old way. Somewhere around 60 of them joined the plot. In public, it was led by two men, Brutus and Cassius, but it also leaned heavily on Decimus Brutus, one of Caesar's own trusted generals, someone close enough to get near him when it mattered. And the warnings were everywhere if anyone had wanted to see them. A fortune teller named Spurina had told Caesar flatly, "Beware the Ides of March." On the walk to the Senate that morning, Caesar actually ran into him and joked that the Ides had come and nothing had happened yet. Spurina's answer: they'd come. They just hadn't gone. His wife, Calpurnia, had a nightmare so bad the night before that she begged him to stay home. He agreed, until Decimus Brutus talked him out of it, telling him it would look weak, that the Senate was waiting. And in the crowd outside, a teacher named Artemidorus pushed forward with a scroll. It laid out the entire plot, names included. He pressed it straight into Caesar's hand. Caesar thought it was just another petition. He folded it up to read later. He never got the chance. So here's our hinge point, and notice how small it is. This isn't, what if Caesar never crossed the Rubicon, or what if he never won the Civil War? It's much smaller than that, which is what makes it unsettling. Caesar reads the scroll, or listens to his wife, or Decimus Brutus, for some reason, doesn't talk him into going that morning. Any one of those small moments goes differently and the meeting gets postponed, or moved, or properly guarded. The conspirators lose their nerve, and the dictator, who was already 3 days from leaving Rome to lead 16 legions and 10,000 cavalry against the Parthian Empire, just leaves on schedule, alive, at the height of his power, with an army behind him and nobody left in the city organized enough to stop him. Now think about everything that quietly disappears. No funeral in the Forum, no Mark Antony reading Caesar's will to a furious crowd and turning them into a mob, no Brutus and Cassius fleeing east to raise armies of their own, no alliance between Antony, Octavian, and a general named Lepidus carving up Rome between them, and no proscriptions. The ugly part that historically came next, lists of enemies' names nailed up in the Forum, bounties on their heads. Around 300 senators died that way. Cicero, Rome's greatest speaker, was one of them. His hands were nailed up on the very platform where he used to give speeches. None of that happens here. Cicero keeps writing, keeps talking, keeps being the most annoying man in Roman politics for however many years he's got left. No Battle of Philippi 2 years later, no Brutus and Cassius falling on their own swords. An entire generation of Rome's most famous names simply doesn't die in the 40s BC. Why would they? The man they'd have been fighting over is still alive. And he's still holding every card. Which brings us to the real question, what does Caesar do with a Rome that never got the chance to fall apart behind him? Here's where it gets strange if you already know what happens in the real timeline. The man who eventually wins the chaos after Caesar's actual death is his own grandnephew, an 18-year-old named Octavian, adopted as Caesar's son in his will. History later calls him Augustus, Rome's first emperor. And once Octavian's on top, he spends 40 years running an elaborate trick. He never calls himself king, he calls himself first citizen. He keeps the Senate around, keeps the old elections running, all while quietly making sure none of it actually decides anything anymore. It's probably the cleverest piece of political theatre in the ancient world. And it's exactly why Rome's shift from republic to empire felt, to the people living through it, less like a takeover and more like a slow, dignified retirement. Caesar never had that patience. He'd already accepted dictator for life. He was already sitting on a golden throne. A Caesar who survives, who comes home from Parthia a winner instead of getting himself killed like the last Roman who tried that war, doesn't need to pretend anything. He has every reason to just take the crown outright. And there's real evidence he was already testing the idea, letting rumors spread that Rome's own religious prophecies said only a king could ever conquer Parthia, just to see how people would react. Which gets us to Parthia, the one war that never gets to happen in real history. And it's a huge missing piece of this story. Back in 53 BC, a Roman general named Crassus marched 7 legions into the desert to fight Parthia and got wiped out by a much smaller cavalry force. He died, Rome lost its pride and its army's silver eagle standards to the enemy. That humiliation sat there unanswered for the rest of Caesar's career. By 44 BC, Caesar had built the biggest army he'd ever commanded, specifically to go finish what Crassus started. So picture it. Instead of dying on the Senate floor, Caesar marches east. Maybe he wins where Crassus failed. Parthia, the one power that had fought Rome to a draw for over a century, gets broken or badly hurt. Rome doesn't actually manage that in real history until 150 years later under an emperor named Trajan, who grabs the same territory briefly in 116 AD before giving it up 2 years later because it's simply too far from Rome to hold. Maybe Caesar even succeeds where Trajan later failed. Rome's eastern border quietly shifts hundreds of miles east for good. That changes nearly every war Rome and Persia fight for the next 600 years, wars that historically wore both empires down right up until Arab armies conquered the exhausted remains of each in the 600s AD. Move that timeline or erase it, and the whole map of the ancient Middle East gets redrawn. There's a quieter side to this too, easy to miss under all the talk of armies and heirs. Caesar wasn't just planning wars in early 44 BC, he was in the middle of the biggest wave of reform Rome had seen in a century. He'd already redesigned the calendar the year before, the solar year calendar we still basically use today, which survived his death and outlived every one of his killers. He was planning new settlements for veterans and Rome's poor outside Italy, pushing citizenship out into the provinces faster than the old aristocrats were comfortable with. Planning a public law code, a public library, even a project to reroute a river running through the city. A Caesar who lives another 10 or 15 years actually finishes these projects instead of leaving them as scraps for Augustus to quietly pick up decades later and claim as his own. A lot of what people credit Augustus for, provincial policy, citizenship, big building projects, was Caesar's blueprint first. Let him live to finish it himself, and Augustus starts looking less like a genius architect and more like a very talented contractor working off somebody else's plans. One more current worth mentioning, where Rome's cultural center of gravity ends up. Caesar spoke fluent Greek, wrote like a Greek historian, loved Alexandria enough to risk a dangerous winter there against his own advisors' warnings. A Caesar who lives another decade and a half, maybe with an heir born in Alexandria, in the mix, pulls Rome's elite culture east toward the Greek-speaking world, faster than it actually drifted there. Latin doesn't go anywhere. It's still the language of law and the army, but philosophy, medicine, royal style, all of it tilts east a generation or two earlier than it really did. Now suppose Caesar actually comes home, victorious, rich off Parthian gold, backed by an army that owes him everything. That's when you hit the question his real assassination just delayed by killing him before it mattered. Who inherits all of this? In actual history, Caesar's will named Octavian, his 18-year-old grandnephew, as his adopted son and heir. Nobody saw it coming, including Octavian. That single adoption is what let a teenager outmaneuver battle-hardened generals twice his age and eventually become Augustus. That wall already exists in 44 BC. It doesn't disappear just because Caesar survives. But now there's a second claimant, one nobody in Rome wanted to say out loud: Caesarion, Caesar's actual son, born in 47 BC to Cleopatra, Queen of Egypt. She'd already named the boy Caesar's heir back in Alexandria and given him the title King of Kings. Rome didn't legally recognize marriage to a foreigner, so Caesarion had no claim at home, and Caesar had never formally acknowledged him there. But a living Caesar has years to change that, not days. Years to decide whether to bring that boy into the succession, to fuse Rome, the oldest republic in the Mediterranean, with Egypt, the last great Greek kingdom, into one family, Roman blood and Egyptian blood, ruling from two capitals instead of one. This is probably the single biggest fork in the whole story. Lean towards Caesarion even a little, even just by keeping the option open for a decade, and Alexandria stops being a kingdom Rome eventually just swallows, which is what actually happened in 30 BC. It becomes something closer to a second capital, with Egyptian wealth and Greek learning, flowing straight into the center of Roman power instead of arriving afterward as spoils. Lean toward Octavian, the safer choice for a Roman public that already found Cleopatra scandalous, and you probably get years of tension between an aging dictator and two rival heirs, each quietly building a network of loyal officers, while Caesar refuses to settle it. That's exactly the kind of standoff that could spill into the very civil war his survival was supposed to prevent, just delayed, fought between different names. And here's the problem with assuming any of this just settles down peacefully. The anger that produced the real conspiracy doesn't vanish just because that one plot failed. If anything, a Caesar who comes home richer, more popular, and acting more like a king than ever is a bigger target, not a smaller one. Decimus Brutus is still out there. Cassius is still out there, still convinced the Republic is worth dying for. A failed plot in 44 BC doesn't mean no plot ever again. It just means the next one has to be better planned. Caesar knows it too. Tighter guards. A Senate purged of anyone who so much as looked at Brutus the wrong way. The famously forgiving dictator, the one who pardoned his enemies instead of executing them, starts hardening into something closer to an outright tyrant, ruling through fear. Surviving one assassination attempt rarely teaches a person mercy. It teaches paranoia. Zoom out, and here's what's genuinely strange about all this. The Roman Empire you actually know. An emperor who insists he's just a regular citizen, a senate that keeps meeting for centuries even though it barely matters anymore. A whole political culture built around the polite fiction that Rome never really stopped being republic. That specific theatrical shape only exists because Augustus had to win an ugly, exhausting set of civil wars, then spend the rest of his life convincing everyone it had been about restoring order, not grabbing a crown. Take that whole chain of events away, let Caesar live and consolidate power on his own terms instead. You probably don't get that same careful disguise at all. You get monarchy without the costume, Rome becoming an openly hereditary kingdom a full generation earlier than it actually did, without the propaganda machine that made the change feel to the people living through it like nothing had really changed. What happens after that is genuinely hard to say. Almost everything we think of as Roman imperial history, the emperors who followed Augustus, the civil wars a century later, the slow shift of power east to Constantinople, assumes Augustus's specific setup as the starting point. Pull that starting point out, replace it with an openly monarchical dynasty, maybe even split between a Roman line and an Egyptian one, and you're not looking at a slightly different empire. You're looking at a different empire altogether, one that might split apart along that Rome-Alexandria seam centuries before it actually happened under an emperor named Diocletian, or one that might hold together even better because that Eastern wealth and legitimacy got built in from day one instead of bolted on after a war. One lost ripple, and it's the one nobody in the Senate that morning would ever have guessed at. The province of Judea, the small restless region that would go on to produce Christianity within about a century, doesn't exist in a bubble. Its governors, its policies, how much religious freedom it gets, all of that comes from decisions made at the very top of an empire that, in this version, looks structurally different. That doesn't mean the pressures building in Judea just disappear. Those were mostly local, mostly older than Caesar himself. But the empire those pressures run into isn't the one history actually got. That's about as far as we can honestly push this. Past a certain point, we're too many steps removed from March 15th, 44 BC to say anything real. Still, it's a useful reminder. Pulling one man's death out of one afternoon doesn't just rewrite Roman politics, it reshuffles the deck for everything that comes after for centuries. What I keep coming back to is how small the actual hinge really is. Not a battle, not an army, a folded piece of paper in one man's hand, a wife's bad dream, a friend's persuasive word on the walk to work. Caesar reads the scroll, or he doesn't. He stays home, or he doesn't. 23 wounds happen, or none of them do. And depending on which way that one ordinary morning tips, you either get the Rome you learned about in school, or you get a dynasty straddling two continents that never had to pretend it was anything other than exactly what it was. The most powerful man in the world came within an unread letter of finding out which future he was going to get. He just never opened it.